All right, good morning and welcome to this special episode. It's actually a special request from one of my patrons to go through this question regarding intracranial pressure. Now, we did go through cerebral blood flow in episode 4, but this one is going to be different. Okay, so it's going to be an extension on some of the ideas that we talked about with regards to the regulation of cerebral blood flow. And as always, with the breakdown of the short answer questions, we're going to review the exams report, look at the literature which I used, and show an answer structure. With regards to writing an answer to time, we may not have time to do that today because there's actually a lot to cover. Now, this is the question from 2009, question 9. Discuss the physiological factors that determine intracranial pressure, ICP. Describe how changes in posture affect ICP. And looking at the examiner's report, so in general, the candidates answered the question well based on the Monro-Kellie doctrine. The answers should have included some introductory definition of intracranial pressure, normal values, and the Monro-Kellie framework, the effects and causes of changes in intracranial blood volume, tissue volume, and CSF production, circulation, and reabsorption, a discussion of how supine, erect, and Trendelenburg positions might alter CSF and blood dynamics. Additional marks were awarded for graphs of changes in ICP with intracranial volume and the relationship between CSF absorption, production, and ICP. And these are the concepts that we should try to avoid, or there were mistakes in the explanation of. So many candidates spent a lot of time explaining cerebral blood flow and cardiovascular responses to changes in posture that were not directly relevant to the question. It was also common for candidates to erroneously rearrange various equations, for example, and these equations are incorrect, which the ones that they've provided. So these are the ones that trainees have put into their answer, which they've rearranged, but rearranged incorrectly. So the ones that the examiner saw was ICP equals MAP times cerebral perfusion pressure, or even ICP equals cerebral blood flow divided by cerebral vascular resistance. And use these as bases for the answer rather than discussing real physiological cause and effect. Now, this is a summary of the exams report. So to get a pass, we needed definitions and normal values of ICP and the Monro-Kellie doctrine. And we also needed to discuss the changes in effect to tissue volume, cerebral blood volume, CSF production and reabsorption, and the effect of posture on CSF and cerebral blood volume. You could get a good pass and extra marks with quite simply putting some graphs in. And the ones that they specifically mentioned was the intracranial volume versus ICP and the ICP versus CSF absorption production. Now, this is the literature I used, so quite extensive. And what I'll do is at the end of this talk, I will post up all these resources on the Patreon page. And for those sort of listening now, what I did was I went through Miller's chapter 11 and 57, Parancam chapters 5 and 6, Chambers, which is not my favorite text, but it was quite useful. And certainly chapter 49, there were some resources, the key concepts, which I got from there. And then some articles from Partington, Oswald, which were from Anaesthesia and Intensive Care Medicine. And for those who want to know how I got access to them, you can go through the ANZCA journal website. Other articles which are freely available is Harari and Wilson as well. Now, first question. So what is intracranial pressure? So ICP equals the force per unit area within the cranial vault, and normal values is 5 to 15 millimeters of mercury or 7 to 20 centimeters of water, because sometimes you might see that measured in those units. And it's measured at the external auditory meatus in the supine position. What is the Monro-Kellie doctrine? The Monro-Kellie doctrine talks about the rigid cranium forming a fixed brain volume, which consists of brain parenchyma, CSF, and blood. And this is verbatim from Parancam. So within the cranial vault, changes in the volume of any one component will alter the volume of one or more of the other components of the cranial contents. That's where it ends. And I think for completeness, you need to add the second line, which is for pressure to remain constant. Otherwise, ICP increases. And you'll see different variations of that idea across multiple definitions of the Monro-Kellie doctrine. But I think it is important to talk about the compensatory volume changes and how they affect pressure. Values of brain parenchyma. So with regards to the volume in the brain parenchyma, it's about, if we convert that from grams to mils, it's about 1,300 to 1,400 mils. Now, the next question is values for CSF. When we talk about CSF, it's 150 mils in total, with 75 mils in the cranial vault and 75 mils in the spinal subarachnoid space. What is the values of the cerebral blood volume? Now, this is from Miller's chapter 11. In the normal brain, cerebral blood volume is approximately 5 mils per 100 grams of brain, and over a PaCO2 range of approximately 25 to 70 millimeters of mercury, cerebral blood volume changes by approximately 0.049 mils per 100 grams for each millimeter of mercury change in PaCO2. And so that equates to about 70 mils in a 1,400 gram brain. This is where you'll start to see different numbers. And I want to sort of show you those different numbers in a second. All right. Because I think this is really, really important. Now, before we do that, I just want to summarize. So in the rigid cranium, you've got brain parenchyma, you've got CSF, and you've got cerebral blood volume. Brain parenchyma actually is 90%, CSF 5%, and cerebral blood volume 5%. Okay, where of that 70 mils, 1/3 is in the arterial system and about 2/3 in the venous system. This slide here is going to be controversial. And this is where I think I think that you do need to be a bit conservative with this, because this is physiologically correct, but this is not what is described in textbooks, specifically Power and CAM. And I'll sort of show you some other numbers around the internet, which are a little bit different. So the ones around the internet are 80% for brain parenchyma, 10% for CSF, 10% for cerebral blood volume. What I want you to do is, I want you to understand this, and I know it's wrong, but I want you to reproduce what Power and CAM has, described in his text for the written exam. For the vivas, I think you can have a bit of leeway, because then this is where you can actually have that discussion with the examiner. And this is where you can actually show your smarts in terms of understanding this. All right. But I think for the written exam, because you don't have that ability to discuss it with another person, in other words, once you write it down, that's it. They can't sort of question, like, what are you thinking? My advice to you is that for the written exam, follow what has been taught in most of the other textbooks. Okay. But know that it's not quite right. And there's really been only one site that I've seen which has the right value. So this is in a website called openanesthesia.org. And you can see how they describe intracranial pressure. The normal brain weighs about 1,400 grams and contains 75 cc's of CSF and 75 cc's of blood. This is one of the rare places that I found it. And to be honest with you, this was incredibly frustrating, because what took up actually a lot of my time during this week was understanding the numbers in terms of the maths of it, but not seeing that correlated with a lot of the textbooks and resources on the internet, and also on the prescribed textbooks as well. And, you need to be aware, because I can show you right now. So the article says at any moment in time, the intracranial blood volume is 100 to 130 mils. So that's almost double of what we said, and the CSF volume is 75 mils, which is what we agreed on. And this article here from Wilson in the Journal of Cerebral Blood Flow and Metabolism was actually referenced on Wikipedia. So on Wikipedia, if you look up cerebral blood volume, it will have exactly the same components as it does in this article here. And then also look at the ones from Deranged Physiology, which I think is an excellent website. Don't get me wrong, excellent summary of a lot of the key ideas, okay? But on Deranged Physiology, you've got brain tissue, 1400 mils, cerebral blood volume, 150 mils, CSF, 150 mils. Where did they get this from? They got this from Chambers, right? So Chambers has exactly the same values here. And even other websites on the internet. So teachmesurgery.com, they've got CSF volume 150 mils, blood volume 150 mils, brain parenchyma 1400 mils. Remember that CSF volume is distributed 75 mils in the cranial vault, 75 mils in the spinal cord. And then even on YouTube, you've got these numbers here. And even on other journal articles, you've got the distribution of CSF and blood as about 10% each. So I think what you can see is that there has been that perpetuation of a misconception that now it's almost become truth. Most consultants won't dig any deeper because this actually requires a really sort of deep understanding of the physiology and the maths involved. But I hope you sort of see how there's a lot of discrepancy. And just going back again, there is actually a source which actually talks about the right values, but I've only seen one so far. This is the one from Power and Cam. So this is the figure 6.6. So I think most people will quote these numbers where brain tissue is 80 to 85%, CSF volume is 70 to 10%, which represents 75 mils, and cerebral blood volume is 5 to 8%. And I'll put a post up on this on Instagram because I think this is where it confuses a lot of people. Because if you use that 7 to 10% for 75 mils, what's your brain tissue volume? It's probably half of what's normal if you do the maths. Now, I want to talk about the relationship between cerebral blood flow and cerebral blood volume, because I think this is where it confuses a lot of trainees. I want to show you this really nice workflow diagram in Miller's chapter 57. What I really want to focus on is these components here. So we know that this is part of the Monro-Kellie doctrine, where we've got the blood volume, CSF volume, and this represents the brain volume or the brain parenchyma, okay? Now we're going to talk about what increases the blood volume. So really, two things can increase the blood volume. Anything that increases blood flow in. So these are factors that will affect your cerebral blood flow. So in other words, PaCO2, PaO2, anesthetics, vasodilators, seizures. So these affect your CMRO2, okay? And these will affect blood going in. What also affects blood volume is blood going out. So any obstruction to the venous drainage. So anything that increases airway or intrathoracic pressure, which increases your jugular venous pressure. And you can also think about other things that increase jugular venous pressure, such as ties around the neck as well. And I think this one is really, really important in understanding the relationship of cerebral blood flow and cerebral blood volume. So the way that flow can increase volume is an increase in flow or through an obstruction to outflow. And this is a summary from episode 4 when we talked about cerebral blood flow. You know, when we look at PaCO2, which is one of the key modifiers of cerebral blood flow, that it changes about 1 to 2 mils per 100 grams per minute for each millimeter of mercury of PaCO2 between 20 to 80 millimeters of mercury. And when we look at it in terms of a percentage, we can say that cerebral blood flow changes by 2 to 4%, for every millimeters of mercury of PaCO2 between 20 to 80 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so I think that is one of the key concepts that we need to know of how cerebral blood flow changes with CO2. Now, we also know from that previous slide that I showed you, which talks about how cerebral blood volume changes with CO2. So this is the one from Miller's chapter 11. So we just go through this again. In the normal brain, cerebral blood volume is approximately 5 mils per 100 grams of brain, and over a PaCO2 range of approximately 25 to 70 millimeters of mercury, cerebral blood volume changes by approximately 0.049, which I just say is 0.05 mils per 100 grams for each millimeter of mercury change in PaCO2. Now, I've just done this so that you understand the relationship between cerebral blood flow and cerebral blood volume. So remember, with cerebral blood flow, 1 to 2 mils per 100 grams for every millimeter of mercury of CO2 change. And that represents 2 to 4%, as you said. Now, when we talk about it in terms of cerebral blood volume, okay, it changes 0.05 mils per 100 grams per millimeter of mercury, which means that it is a 1% change for every millimeter of mercury. And you see that this is where that idea of, yes, your cerebral blood flow increases by X amount. Your cerebral blood volume also increases, but not to the same extent. And really, the relationship is described in this diagram here in Miller's chapter 11. So this diagram shows that an increase in cerebral blood flow of 50% results in a change of blood volume of only 20%. Okay, so the ratios are about 2.5 to 1, which is sort of within this range here. So you can see that there's 2 to 4%, which is about 2.5% and 1%. If you can remember the numbers, fantastic. But I think that's one of the key concepts that I do want you to remember, is that it's not a one-to-one change for blood flow and blood volume. Okay. I think the most important one to remember is the blood flow one. So that's often asked quite a bit. I think that if you can't remember the exact numbers, don't worry. I think what you just described is that cerebral blood volume just changes less than CBF. Good. Now, I think a really common question, which we can talk about, so the physiological mechanisms of how they maintain ICP, is what compensation occurs when you have an intracranial mass. So the compensation that occurs, it's important to maintain ICP stable as your CPP equals MAP minus ICP. All right. And the way that you do it, you can think about it two ways. So not just cerebral blood volume, but then also split that off into arterial and venous blood. And it's really venous blood that's going to be displaced. So venous blood gets displaced from the dural venous sinuses into the jugular veins because they're valvulous. And the CSF, you get displacement from the ventricles via the cerebral aqueduct through the foramen magnum and into the spinal subarachnoid space. You also get increased absorption via the arachnoid villi, and your production remains the same. Now, this is where you would draw your diagram for your CSF absorption, reabsorption. And this is the diagram from Power and Cam. As you can see, it is a little bit incomplete. All right. So the units, I'm not sure what has happened here, but there's obviously a typo somewhere. The original diagram, all right, has come from Ganong. This is the original diagram from Ganong. A couple of things here that you'll see is that with regards to the x-axis, it's millimeters of CSF. It starts off at 68, which is about 70, which has been translated to centimeters of CSF by a lot of trainees, which is why you'll get 7 here. Okay. And the other thing that you'll note is that it's 0 on the x-axis here, but it starts off 0 above here. Okay. So often you'll see the x-axis drawn here instead, like down here. All right. So that's why you get that sort of different representation here. All right. So 0 on the x-axis here, but obviously it must be like minus 0.2 here. And then it's 0 here. And then, yeah, with the mils per minute, 0.35. 0.35 is where you want it to cross the y-axis, because that will give you 500 mils a day. And this is the diagram that you want to learn and be able to reproduce in the exam. Okay, now with the management, this one here, I would only add this in if you had time. All right, it doesn't really answer the question, but I think that, you know, it does give you a little bit of context in terms of what you can do to assist the physiological mechanisms to maintain ICP. So with CSF, you know, we talk about draining via extraventricular drain or ventricular shunt. Venous blood, you want to promote drainage through gravity, minimizing PEEP, avoid occlusions, avoid coughing and straining. Arterial blood is more about maintaining your pressure and your oxygenation, okay, and reducing demand. So remember, we're not trying to reduce arterial blood flow. We're trying to maintain arterial blood flow, but at the same time, we're also trying to reduce demand as well. With the brain parenchyma, with looking at decreasing the extracellular fluid through osmotic diuresis, decreasing swelling through DEX or surgical removal of the mass, and then if all else fails, a decompressive craniectomy. So this is the volume versus ICP diagram. So as you increase the intracranial volume, there's compensation that occurs up to a point, and then after that, it starts to decompensate. And again, note the X and Y axes. Okay, they've got centimeters of water here, and over here they've got volume, but with no units there. You'll see it represented differently in different texts, and I'll sort of show you. So this is the one from Miller's. So Miller's is just a diagram with no units. So you've got intracranial volume here, you've got compensation reaching its maximum, and then after that, you see this exponential rise. This is the one from Chambers. So Chambers talks about intracranial pressure in millimeters of mercury. Note that previously, remember, parenchyma was in centimeters of water. This one's in millimeters of mercury. So this one here talks about compensatory mechanisms occurring up to a point. And then once you reach above 20 millimeters mercury, which is, I think, one of the key numbers that a lot of people talk about, where ischemia starts to happen. And so they talk about focal ischemia occurring at that point, and above around sort of 40, 45, that's when you sort of get global ischemia. Certainly, you'll see numbers above 50 millimeters of mercury is when you definitely start to get global ischemia. So this diagram here, you'll see it represented in, I think, a lot of internet texts, such as Life in the Fast Lane. This is where it comes from. It came from Chambers. I quite like this from this article here from Anaesthesia and Intensive Care. So this one talks about the elastance curve, but it also talks about the compensation that occurs at each point. So as you can see that there's venous compensation, all right? And it's a very, very compliant system. And then you get CSF compensation. And then finally, arterial compensation, which is not very compliant at all, okay? But the primary ways that you compensate a rise in intracranial pressure through a mass effect is through displacement of venous blood and also displacement of CSF as well. And this is the diagram from another journal in Anesthesia and Intensive Care. The really nice thing is they've sort of showed you what happens at the end. So yes, it increases exponentially, but there's obviously a limit. Okay, so at this point here, it can't increase anymore, and this is where death occurs. This is quite nice in terms of telling you how the compensation can occur on either side. So you can either drain CSF or you can drain cerebral blood volume, which is primarily through venous blood. Now, we're going to finally go through what are the changes in posture. And look, with supine to upright, the overall effect is that ICP decreases, but not to the same effect as the hydrostatic difference. And the reason that ICP initially decreases is that, yes, you do get that displacement into the spinal subarachnoid space. There's increased drainage into the valvulus jugular veins. And arterial blood, your cerebral blood flow should remain pretty constant, okay? Because it's autoregulated primarily via the myogenic mechanism. So even though that, when you go from supine to standing, your baroreceptors are kicking in, but at that initial moment, there is that slight decrease in your mean arterial pressure. What happens is that with the myogenic mechanism, it should still maintain your cerebral blood flow. And by doing that, it counteracts the hydrostatic differences that occur, which is why ICP decreases, but not to the same effect. Going from supine to head down, it's the opposite. So ICP increases, but again, not to the same effect as the hydrostatic difference. The reason for that, of why it increases, is that yes, you get displacement now from the spinal subarachnoid space into the cranial vault. You've got reduction in drainage, because remember that the venous system is valvulus, and it's also 20 times more compliant than the arterial system. All right, so it's gonna expand. And then with the arterial blood, there is an initial increase due to the gravitational effects, but then after that, you get it returned back to normal, again through autoregulation via the myogenic mechanism. And then after that, this is where you might see it decrease. All right, and this is where you can incorporate the formulas in. Now, if your MAP is constant, and with the head down position, if you get that venous congestion, if you get that increase in CSF, you start getting an increase in your ICP or CVP or JVP, what happens is that you get a reduction in your cerebral perfusion pressure. And why do you get a reduction in your cerebral perfusion pressure? It's because of the formula, CPP equals MAP minus ICP and JVP. And then if your cerebral vascular resistance is constant, so remember that your CVR is mainly affected by PO2, PCO2, CMRO2, okay? And also by the myogenic mechanism as well. And so if we assume that your cerebral vascular resistance is constant, a reduction in your cerebral perfusion pressure will result in a reduction in cerebral blood flow. Because remember that cerebral blood flow equals your perfusion pressure divided by your cerebral vascular resistance. So this would be my structure to the short answer question. I would have the definition and normal values of ICP and Monro-Kellie doctrine. I will talk about the physiological compensations, where I will draw the intracranial volume versus the ICP graph. And then I would explain the effects of CSF and venous blood. And that's where under CSF, I would also draw the ICP versus CSF absorption production graph. And then thirdly, as part of this question, I will talk about the effect of posture, talking about supine to upright and supine to Trendelenburg.